Okay, so I'm Steve Cole. I'm from Hope Lab. And you might wonder what Hope Lab was, particularly after Kathleen mentioned us before. We also are involved in the enterprise of promoting pro-social behavior. We are sort of more out in the world, I think, than most of the folks talking today. And as a result, we're sloppier and it's a big, messy story that I'm going to be telling you. And we're also basically more stupid when we pick targets. So instead of doing something, tractable, like working with an organization or something like that, we work with the sort of the human definition of disorganization, which is teenagers. And our job basically is to try and somehow, and persuade is not even the right word here, somehow help teenagers carry out behaviors that are going to be ultimately protective for their health. That's obviously futile because teenagers, feel this, well described sense of invincibility and unlimited lifespan. So clearly there are some big challenges there. One of the advantages we have in our self-charter, though, is a focus particularly on kids who are confronting health issues already. And so the giant data-laden anecdote that I'm going to talk about today basically has to do with the remission video game for kids with cancer. And so if you're a teenager and you have the most common kind of cancer in that age group, acute lymphocytic leukemia, you will go through about a month or so of intensive chemotherapy in the hospital, just like you see on ER, sort of standard patient on the conveyor belt of the medical factory experience. At the end of about, sort of 6 weeks or so of that, 99% of the cancer cells in the patient's body will have been eradicated, and the patient will be in remission. And the patient is really happy when that happens because that sounds like I've been cured. And your parents are saying, wow, you're going to live. It's great, wonderful. Your doctor's really proud of himself because he's put you into remission. It's like that great heroic thing. So, it's generally a really, really positive event. But in this process of celebrating all this, sort of, beating the piñata of your health, if you will, someone, your physician, will tell you, by the way, you're not completely out of the woods. In fact, although we are going to discharge you, you're going to need to take this pill right here once a day for the next 2 to 3 years. So that's a 6-mercaptopurine maintenance chemotherapy pill. These kids, basically, by the time they're teenagers, it's pretty much up to them whether this pill gets taken or not. And if you think about it for a second, a pill every day for 2 to 3 years is more than 1,000 pills. That's a lot of pills that they pretty much have to take with very little margin for error. And actually what we know is that teenagers avail themselves of that margin for error quite a lot. So about 20 to 30% of adolescent cancer patients are missing 20% or more of their maintenance chemotherapy doses. We know this because we audit the chemotherapy in their blood. We literally say, wow, you've got chemotherapy metabolites in there, or no, you've got such low levels of these metabolites that there's almost no possible way that you could have been taking even perhaps the majority of your doses. So that's our challenge. That's one example of the kind of thing that Hope Lab goes after. How are we going to make teenagers more perfect participants in their own medical treatment enterprise? This is the way we typically do it in medicine right now. As the doctor is discharging the patient, she will say something like, this is the reason why it's really important. So originally there were 100 billion cancer cells in your body, and you can imagine what a teenager is doing at this point, right? They're just like, I would really like to go home and hang out with my friends because I've been in the hospital a long time. So, you don't really need to pay any attention to that lecture because essentially they don't pay any attention to it. Although that's actually, I'm being a little bit glib there. They do pay attention to it, but it doesn't stick with them and change their behavior in the really persistent, durable way that we need it to optimally protect their health. So, when they miss those 20% of their maintenance chemotherapy doses, it occurs to me I should have pointed this out earlier, the risk of having a rebound of leukemia goes up. But it doesn't go up by 20%. It goes up by more than 200%. So they've literally doubled their risk of avoidable death simply by virtue of the fact that they're not perfect, sort of adherence machines running through life with nothing else on their minds except the notion that I might not, have to take my maintenance chemotherapy pill right now. So these kinds of lectures, these rational sort of knowledge-driven explanations about why you should carry out this behavior, sort of get in the front door And they may influence, sort of the patient's perceived sort of significance of these kinds of health protective behaviors, like taking every last one of these pills, for a short period of time. But what we know is they don't stick with you for 2 to 3 years. So what's the alternative? What are other things that we could possibly do? Well, here's the Hope Lab alternative, is you throw the patient inside the body of another patient who's in remission from acute lymphocytic leukemia. You have them pilot Roxy, the nanobot, around inside the bone marrow there. I'm not sure if you guys can really even see that very well, but in there you discover, hey, there's still a few leukemia cells there, whereupon you begin to lay waste to them with your radiation gun and your chemo rockets and all that good stuff. So that's the remission video game for cancer, and it actually, as you'll see later, turns out to work surprisingly well. There's no obvious reason at this point why it should work, right? I mean, it looks just like a normal video game, essentially a fundamentally, entertainment-based experience. So, how is it that it's actually got any kind of prayer of creating this persistent, durable, sort of adherence behavior when we can't with much more powerful, logical, rational arguments? Well, the key to understanding why it works lies in understanding why the patients aren't taking their maintenance chemotherapy in the first place. And so as a kind of explanation of that, I'll walk you through the story of our friend Ranjit here, 17-year-old guy, getting ready to go to college. And Ranjit's whole world is basically shaped by, his behavior today is shaped by the kind of person he wants to become, the things he wants to do in the future. It's all about what's going on in the future, who he is, who he's going to be, what he's going to do. So Ranjit, for example, wants to travel the world, see all kinds of interesting places, meet all kinds of exciting people, and synthesize those experiences into these vivid, compelling stories that not only move other people, but basically win him an Oscar for Best Screenplay. And when he's not winning that Oscar for Best, frankly, these stories should be so good that while he's at it, he should win the Nobel Prize for Literature, frankly. And when he's not winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, he wants to be a rock star. So this is the stuff that lives in his head. Now everybody's laughing because we all secretly know, yeah, actually really most teenagers, and maybe a shockingly large number of adults, actually privately think about this stuff. This stuff swims through our minds. This is, in some sense, the current that you're swimming against if you're trying to get Ranjit to take every last one of those pills. So if Ranjit's got acute lymphocytic leukemia, he's got to take those 1,000 pills, or else he's not going to have that future as a rock star, or even the corporate accountant that he eventually actually turns out to become. So, Ranjit is thinking about all of this kind of stuff, and that's why he misses those doses. It's not because he is belligerent, although, well, never mind, that's the teenager story. I don't want to go too far in that direction. But it's mostly not because he's trying not to do them or he's, willfully defiant. It's because he's basically got other things on his mind. These kids are all about getting their original healthy identity back. And frankly, taking maintenance chemotherapy pills is part of an unhealthy, sick, dying identity that they are trying to get away from. It's not cognitively, or if you will, associatively, because it's not really fundamentally about cognition. It's going to turn out to be mostly about emotion and motivation. But it's not aligned with sort of the motivational axis between me, Ranjit, right now where I am, and the future of being a rock star. Anything that's on that beam is going to happen spontaneously. Anything that's off of it is basically competing with that. So who's going to help him be this perfect adherent? The answer is this woman, Pam Omidyar. She's sitting here working in a laboratory at Stanford a decade or so ago. And she basically was working in a cancer lab, stares down the tube of a microscope all day long, watching cancer cells battle it out with cells of the immune system. And she realizes that because she can literally see this epic struggle between life and death, she understands sort of not only the biology of the disease, but the significance of the patient's role in things like, sort of the mundane act of taking a pill. She understands these very differently because she has this big, vivid, sort of personal mental image of what's going on in a way that most patients, frankly, never will have. And then Pam goes home at night and plays video games. Pam loves video games because they put her in control. They make her, in some sense, the author of her own entertainment experience. And one of the things she notices is that although she doesn't win all the time, the more she plays, the more she wins. The more she wins, the more powerful and effective a person she feels. Now, Pam's no idiot. She knows that what's the point of being powerful and effective if you're just blasting virtual aliens on a TV screen? But it doesn't matter because the emotion is still there. The motivation is still there. She still feels better about herself as a function of that experience, as you know, sort of absurd as it might seem in this harsh daylight. So at some point, Pam puts 2 and 2 together and gets 25. She realizes, you know, if I could just build a video game for kids with cancer to kind of explain what's going on inside their body and help them understand not only sort of on a sort of a knowledge level what's going on, but understand the significance of their own behavior and shaping ultimately whether they're going to survive. I might potentially be able to rebrand the idea of, man, this is the boring 375th pill that I need to take in a total of 1,000 or something like that, into something much more heroic. Man, I just fired a chemo rocket at that big, you know, sort of like cluster of bad guys still left in the back end of my bone marrow or something like that. So, seems like a good idea, but it's going nowhere because Pam knows to make a good video game, you need a bunch of people, you need a bunch of time, and you need a bunch of money, and Pam doesn't have any of those things. But things start to look up when her husband comes home and says, honey, I invented eBay. What do you want to do the rest of your life? And the first thing Pam does is she goes out and she founds Hope Lab, a foundation basically sort of focused on harnessing the power of play in the service of health by changing people's behavior. And she hooks up with a really bright, talented health psychologist, Pam Cato, and the two Pams set about brewing up a recipe for creating play-based experiences that change behavior by changing your psychology. And so I'm going to run really quickly through just like a couple of these in the interest of time. I don't want to suck up too much of our bandwidth here. One of the major features when you're sculpting these kinds of games has to do with the backstory or the setup. So remember, the backstory here is simply like, oh, you're in the body of a patient in remission, just like you, kid. And they think everything is fine. But you can see that there's still a few bad guy cells here. Boy, that means that it's possible to feel like you're fine and actually still have disease lurking in your body in this small way. In this way that's kind of really evil and violates your sense of what's right and good and, you know, you clearly want to overcome. So, you know, sort of getting information across in these non-verbal, non-propositional forms, or in another way of putting it is the proposition is baked in the contingencies of gameplay instead of actually you know, sort of like delivered in the verbal form of the lecture that I showed you earlier. Another element has to do with what I alluded to earlier, the notion of rebranding certain ambivalent concepts, chemotherapy being a great opportunity for this. So as you probably might imagine, chemotherapy is, you know, an unimaginably ambivalent concept in the mind of cancer patients. They know in their head that it's primarily responsible for saving them, but they feel in their gut that it's killing them. And they're right, it's actually killing them just a little bit more slowly than it's killing the cancer cells, but it is a super viscerally miserable experience. So who's going to like taking maintenance chemotherapy pills if it's branded as part of the cancer experience? If it literally, your body is rejecting it, you know, how is your brain going to get excited about it? Well, what might help is if chemotherapy ends up being, you know, symbolically attached to something a little bit more positive, like your personal victory over cancer. It becomes, in some sense, the bullets in your gun, your sidearm in your battle to get your life back. It seems like, you know, sort of, you know, at least a step in the right direction of, you know, sort of, in some sense, rehabilitating chemotherapy as a positive thing instead of essentially as a thing that you're trying to get away from, and therefore it's not all that surprising that you might, you know, sort of occasionally forget to take these pills. All right, does this kind of stuff work? The great thing about the PAMs is not only are they creative geniuses, but they're also actually both well-trained scientists. So they set up a randomized intervention trial in which we recruited 374 adolescents and young adults from 34 medical centers in the US, Canada, and Australia, all currently under treatment for cancer. And we randomized them to receive either a personal computer containing remission or a personal computer containing the same, basically a control commercial video game. And then we followed these kids over the course of several months afterwards, measuring things like psychological outcomes, behavioral characteristics, and in particular, medical outcomes. We're especially interested in the biological or clinical impact of these kinds of interventions. And so, for instance, one of the things we were looking at is how many kids have these blood chemotherapy levels that are in that dangerously low zone, that zone where it looks like they're missing more than 20% of their maintenance chemotherapy doses. These are these kids that are at more than twofold risk of having a rebound of leukemia, going back to the hospital, possibly dying. So the number of kids that were in that critically low chemotherapy level in the control group was about what we typically see in these studies. I think it was about 18.5% or something like that. Only 8% of the kids who got the remission group were in that dangerously low level. So obviously, we haven't totally won here. We didn't push it down to 0, but we still looked like with something as sort of in some sense trivial, especially at the marginal cost of distribution, easily disseminated intervention, looks like it could knock down as much as 50% of the avoidable risk of death in this particular scenario. So we thought that was actually not a bad outcome, and Hope Lab's whole business is basically centered around trying to generalize this play-based approach to behavioral correction, intervention, maintenance, whatever you want to call it, to a variety of other disease targets. So one of the things we've been interested in is how these interventions work differently from traditional, sort of health communications-based strategies. So one of the ways we've been getting at that is actually scanning the brains of people while they play these games to try and understand what's going on when you play this game that would allow, even an hour or two of gameplay to apparently affect behavior over the course of several months afterwards. And so I'll just skim you through some of the key results here, but one of the areas we see lots of activation is in what they call well, actually I'm not going to reel out too many neuroanatomy terms here. Basically the caudate, the putamen, and the nucleus accumbens, a group of structures involved in positive motivation, or especially incentive motivation. And it's especially the anticipation of good things that seems to light up these areas. So it's not like they're reward areas so much as areas where when you get excited about the proposition of potentially getting something you want, you see it, you're running after it, it's, you can feel victory in the air or something. That's the kind of thing that lights up those brain regions. Another set of structures that gets activated, basically the thalamus, which is in, sort of the brain's information superhighway. It shuttles information from one part of the brain around to other parts of the brain. You can think of it as sort of a good, sort of metric for just general arousal and excitement. And a third part of the brain that shows notable activation is a small structure with outsized importance called the hippocampus, which is, of course, key to translating your momentary experiences into long-term working memory. If you want a short experience like playing a video game to stick with somebody for a good period of time afterwards, that's exactly the structure you'd like to see activated. Now, there's nothing particularly distinctive about the remission video game and activating those brain structures. If you have people play just about any engaging video game, you'll see similar patterns of activation. And what's actually distinctive about these kinds of patterns of activation has mostly to do with your role as an author in the experience, the extent to which you're interactively engaged in creating this experience. We know that because if we just hold constant the information, if we capture the video stream and the audio stream from one person playing the game and give it to another person, we see nowhere near as much activation in those regions. So it doesn't have anything to do with, in some sense, the semantics of what's going on when you're playing here. It's all about the fact that you're involved in creating those experiences. So anyway, that's, in the interest of time, I'm going to bail out here, but that's basically the story we'd like to leave people with in the forefront of their mind is, when we go to change behavior, a lot of times we think about how the behavior, how the situation, the decision, if you will, is framed in our minds. And certainly, most interventions are based on this notion that if you just shove the right piece of information into a brain, people will spontaneously behave the way they should. And what we've learned, especially from working with teenagers, is they're pretty smart, they know a lot of stuff, but they also have some motivational complexities. And often, it's not the knowledge that's missing, it's actually getting the motivational alignment right, figuring out how to get the thing that you want to have happen match up with the person that this person already wants to be. Okay.
What does it sound like when they try to explain themselves, like why they didn't do it?
It sounds like excuse making more than really anything else. Let's say the majority of the kids that have these kinds of problems will say, yeah, I didn't take them, I don't really know why, I was mostly distracted doing this other kind of stuff. They kind of hand wave more than anything else. Now there's a small chunk of kids that have what you might call chaotic social environments, where, like, I didn't take the pill because I didn't know where it was because we were busy moving from one apartment to another or something like that. So there's no totally general answer to that, but for the majority of kids that are in stable social circumstances, they don't offer much in terms of an explanation for that particular behavior. You only discover what's going on when you mine down farther and ask them to talk about You know, how do you feel about your treatment? What do you think about chemotherapy? I mean, from our objective perspective, chemotherapy should be a great thing. Like, it literally, empirically, is what's saving them. A great thing about acute lymphocytic leukemia is that 80 or 90% of these kids are going to live as long as they take their treatment, live like fat, long, normal, happy lives. We're really good at treating this particular kind of malignancy as long as the pills actually get taken. And so it's only when we start to ask them about not so much a particular behavior, but these concepts and how they fit into their lives that you start to understand kind of the violent conflict between you know, sort of the notions that make sense to us not being viscerally involved in the situation and the perspective that they actually hold. Yeah.
I think this is fascinating. I'm trying to think of other applications, and I think certainly one of the issues facing young people today is the whole issue on childhood obesity, which is a whole different set of problems. But I was just wondering, does your organization tackle those kind of things?
That's our second major product, so.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, exactly. When are you going to publish your book? Because she has a little section in her what is it, fireflies or? Dragonflies, that's what they are. Sorry, I knew it was like some bug making light or something like that. But, anyway, so that's, you know, basically that is our primary preoccupation at the moment, is actually getting a product in that area, much less cerebrally, you know, sort of complex and confused than the one I just talked about. It turns out to be much closer to an operant conditioning device than anything else. But yeah, we agree that's a big opportunity for making the, you know, sort of the world a better place. Let me get him first.
Similarly, one analysis of this problem is basically people are seeing these pills and they feel good day to day. You're connecting essentially a behavior that they don't like very much with outcomes they don't see. Now, when it comes to behavior change, it's true in obesity, it's true in lots of drug compliance. It's actually probably true in climate change as well, in the sense that, you know, there's not a connection. Have you thought of, so big picture, do you think these techniques would be, this is sort of, you know, applicable in those sorts of problems, and how would you adapt them?
First, we agree that we think that probably the major active ingredient is making visible propositions that people are aware of, but making them visible in a way that not just is passive. There's a whole sort of, you know, persuasive movie-making version of this kind of stuff. What we're intrigued by is the notion that you might get a lot more kick by getting them involved, sort of like as in actors in a play. So it's almost like those crazy dissonance experiments where you have people play a role and suddenly they come to believe in the, you know, the principles in much the same way we were talking about the, you know, sort of changes in, you know, affective relations. So the visibility of it and the participatory interaction with these concepts. So, you know, if you wanted to do global warming, you know, I'm not enough a creative genius to tell you exactly how you would do this, but something where somebody's in there, you know, sort of participating in the consequences or potentially even causes of the dynamic has a, you know, we would think more of an opportunity to engage those brain regions than simply showing them in a kind of an analogical form, the kind of information that we typically try to deliver in propositional forms. Okay, I haven't forgotten about. Go ahead.
I was just reading Switch, and there's a fascinating, I think, anecdote in there about how it doesn't matter a whole lot how long you play the game. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could give us a quick soundbite on that.
Yeah, so originally we built this game as a cognitive behavioral intervention. Feel free to chop me whenever it needs to happen. So originally we built this game under a very cognitive behavioral theory that we were going to jam a bunch of information and then they just do the right thing. And so and the game is really long. It's got 20 levels. Probably that's about 25 hours worth of total gameplay. We, you know, sort of distribute the game out there, find that, in fact, kids who played the game only a couple of hours showed the same positive outcomes that the kids who'd played through the entire, you know, 20 levels or so. That didn't, you know, sort of match up with the cognitive behavioral approach very well, because presumably those kids that played only a couple of hours got a fairly meager dose of this kind of cognitive adjustment, and yet they did perfectly fine. So at that point, actually, I started thinking, you know, what's going on here must have the kinetics of a commercial. And that's actually when I started talking to Jennifer about this kind of stuff, is you know, like, how do people think about, you know, sort of the psychological and behavioral changes that are unleashed by 30-second marketing enterprises? What's really going on there? And it was very, very helpful to think about it in terms of, sort of the marketing approach based around identity. When you sell a BMW, you don't lecture people about how many great, fine, sort of like numerical details on the engine. You show them a picture of the kind of person they're going to be if they just buy this, right? They're going to be going through the countryside with the, sunshine and the wind blowing through their hair and all these envious people looking at them. And, that's like what they really secretly most aspire to. And so lining your product up and explaining how that's going to get the person to be the ideal self that they want, turned out to be a more coherent explanation. So this leads us to the position of feeling that we accidentally got it right the first time and puts a, sort of a strong burner on us to actually do a second version of the game that is much more focused on these motivational and sort of identity-related drivers of behavior change and much less preachy. I mean, we had a whole series of agonizing lectures delivered by characters in these things. And what we found actually in an experiment is when we pulled those things out, we did even better. So it's almost like the more information we take out of it, the better in an intervention it is. Now I realize.
Just answer the question about time.
Oh, okay, super.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. I'm not even sure.